Over the years, I've been surprised to learn that many of the rule changes made by the FAA are initiated not by the FAA, but are instead dictated by Congress. Last week, the president signed the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2024 into law, and it includes changes that could affect all pilots, including big changes for pilots flying under BasicMed and also for CFIs and for DPEs, that is, pilot examiners. Stick around because I've sorted through the hundreds of changes listed in this bill, and I've pulled out the ones that are most likely to affect you. And after we talk about that, I'll tell you about my recent training on the new Cirrus G7 and about my visit to the Museum of Flight that's located at Boeing Field in Seattle. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books, and I'm the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week in episode 328, we talked about a tragic accident involving a CFI who purchased his dream airplane, a Piper Twin Comanche, but crashed it on the way home. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/328. And if you're new to the show, welcome. It's great to have you here. Now, this is important. Take a moment right now and touch either that subscribe key, or if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key on your phone, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free and you won't miss a thing. And let me remind you that this is a listener-supported show and that we have new ways that you can show your love and support for the show. Just go out to our new support page at aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find links to support the show via PayPal, Venmo, Zelle, and Patreon. And when you make a donation, I'll read your name on the show. Now let's talk about the FAA Reauthorization Bill of 2024 and what it means to you. First, let me explain that the Reauthorization Bill is the bill that authorizes specific programs and sets policy direction for the FAA over a multi-year period. Now, typically it's for a 5-year period, but since Congress is nearly a year late in signing this bill, it's for a 4-year and 4-month period. After the FAA Reauthorization Bill is passed, Congress must then pass annual appropriations bills that actually provide the funding. Those bills allocate specific amounts of money to the FAA for its operations, maintenance, research, and other activities. Now, the bill we're talking about, the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2024, reauthorizes the FAA and the NTSB through September 30th, 2028. And for the first time in recent memory, the reauthorization bill contains a section titled General Aviation. And there are 34 items in that section, and we'll focus on those, but also talk about some of the other sections that may be of general interest to you. Now, the bill runs a staggering 1,083 pages long, and no, I haven't read every page of it. AOPA has a summary of items they found interesting, and in some cases I'll be reading from their list, but their list doesn't include everything in the GA section, so I've added many more items not found in their summary. And before we dive into the items specifically related to general aviation pilots, let's talk briefly about other items related to airline pilots and the general flying public. Now, the most important thing this bill did not do was to raise the retirement age of airline pilots from age 65 to 67. That was in the original version of the bill, but it was pulled out. So airline pilots will still have to retire when they reach their 65th birthday. But they can still continue flying in other commercial jobs, such as corporate and Part 135, just not for the airlines. Now, other changes, all Part 121 air carriers, that would be the airlines, will now be required to have a cockpit voice recorder that runs for 25 hours. And there have been many investigations that have been hampered because some of the CVRs in use only record for 30 minutes, and that's been insufficient for some investigations. And for airline passengers, the bill affirms the DOT's rule that mandates automatic refunds when flights are canceled or significantly delayed. It also makes sure that families can sit together without paying extra fees. And for those flying with serious allergies, the bill states that the FAA must consider whether airplane emergency medical kits should include, quote, appropriate medications and equipment that can practically be administered for anaphylaxis. So that means epinephrine, the first-line medication for treating anaphylaxis. And when it comes to administering epinephrine, Section 368 of the bill opens the door for the FAA rules to mandate epinephrine auto-injectors in planes' medical kits. And it might also cover future needle-free epinephrine options. Now, there are even 2 sections of the bill regarding remote towers. And that's a topic that Rob Mark investigated for several months last summer and that he talked about with us on episode 292. In that episode, we talked about how the FAA has been slow to certify remote towers in the U.S., despite successful demonstrations in Virginia and Colorado, and that there are remote towers in operation in other countries. Section 621 says that the FAA shall create a program and publish milestones to achieve system design and operational approval for a remote tower system. And it says that not later than December 31st of this year, the administrator shall expand the system design approval and evaluation process for a digital or remote tower system to not less than 3 airports at which a digital or remote tower will be installed. And it says most notably, quote, the administrator shall prioritize system design and operational approval for a remote tower system at A, airports that do not have a permanent air traffic control tower at the time of application, B, airports that would provide small and rural community air service, or C, airports that have been newly accepted as of the date of enactment of this subsection into the contract tower program. So in essence, I think Congress is saying that the FAA must prioritize remote towers over building new concrete towers at airports that don't already have a concrete tower. And I think that is good, as remote towers appear far more cost-effective versus building multi-million-dollar concrete towers. Yeah, there's another section that says that the FAA will be required to deploy airport surface situational awareness technologies that can track runway aircraft and vehicle movements. That would be systems such as ASDX, the Airport Surface Detection Equipment. And Section 627 affects helicopter and future eVTOL pilots. It's called Low Altitude Routes for Vertical Flight. It says, A, sense of the Congress. It is the sense of Congress that the National Airspace System requires additional rotorcraft, powerlift aircraft, and low-altitude instrument flight rules routes, leveraging advances in performance-based navigation in order to provide direct, safe, and reliable routes that ensure sufficient separation from higher-altitude fixed-wing aircraft traffic. B, low-altitude rotorcraft and powered-lift aircraft instrument flight routes 1 in general. Not later than 3 years after the date of enactment of this act, the administrator shall initiate a rulemaking process to establish or update as appropriate low-altitude routes and flight procedures to ensure safe rotorcraft and powered-lift aircraft operations in the National Airspace System. 2 requirements. In carrying out this subsection, the administrator shall A, incorporate IFR rules rotorcraft operations into the low-altitude performance-based navigational procedural infrastructure, and B, prioritize the development of new helicopter area navigation instrument flight rules routes as part of the U.S. air traffic service route structure that utilize performance-based navigation such as GPS and GNSS equipment. And finally, C, consider the impact of such low-altitude flight routes on other airspace users and impacted communities to ensure that such routes are designed to minimize 1, potential for conflict with existing national airspace system operations, 2, the workload of air traffic controllers, and 3, negative effects to impacted communities. There are also many references throughout the bill to drones and UAS. One notable change says that they may operate within Class G airspace 1 up to 400 feet above ground level without prior authorization from the administrator, and 2, above 400 feet above ground level with prior authorization from the administrator. So, in other words, with permission, drones could go as high as either 700 feet AGL or up to 1,200 feet AGL, depending upon the location and what the top ceiling is for the Class G airspace in that area. So pilots, watch out when you're flying low. We're going to be sharing that space more and more with drones in the future. Another reference, Section 930, discusses for drones the Beyond Visual Line of Sight Operations, or BVLOS, for UAS, and it directs the FAA to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking within 4 months to establish a performance-based regulatory pathway for UAS to operate in BVLOS. The proposed rule section shall establish acceptable levels of risk for BVLOS operations and standards for remote pilots and ensure the safety of manned aviation. Of course, that's us, manned aviation. And now let's dive into the general aviation section, which is Section 800. Section 801, examination of pilots or certificate holders. This amends the Pilot's Bill of Rights to require the FAA to provide timely information to an airman subject to a re-examination of an airman certificate. FAA must inform the individual of the nature and specific activity of the reexamination, and the reexamination shall occur within 1 year from the date of notice provided by the FAA. However, if the reexamination is not conducted within 30 days, the administrator may restrict passenger carrying operations. And 3, that if such reexamination is not conducted after 1 year from the date of notice, the airman certificate of the individual may be suspended or revoked. Section 802, GAO, Review of Pilot's Bill of Rights. Now, that requires the GAO, or the Government Accountability Office, to submit to Congress a report on the implementation and application of the Pilot's Bill of Rights, including the application of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure and the Federal Rules of Evidence to covered proceedings by NTSB, and the impacts of the implementation of the Pilot's Bill of Rights. Section 803, Aircraft Privacy. It requires the FAA to establish a process by which 1, a private aircraft owner or operator may request the FAA withhold the registration number and other similar identifiable data or information of their aircraft from any public dissemination or display for non-commercial flights. And 2, an aircraft owner or operator may request that the FAA withhold from broad dissemination or display certain personally identifiable information on the Civil Aviation Registry website. So, for example, that might be your home address. The FAA would also be required to establish a program for aircraft owners and operators to apply for a new ICAO aircraft identification code. Now, some of these programs exist today, so it's not clear to me exactly how that expands those current programs. Section 804, Accountability for Aircraft Registration Numbers. It requires the FAA to review the process for reserving aircraft N numbers to ensure equal opportunity for members of the public to obtain specific aircraft registration numbers. Under Section B, Assessment, it says, in conducting the review under subsection A, the administrator shall assess the following. 1, whether use of readily available software to prevent computer or web-based autofill systems from reserving aircraft registration numbers in bulk would improve participation in the reservation process by the general public. And 2, whether a limit should be imposed on the number of consecutive years a person may reserve an aircraft registration number. And I'll mention that anyone who's ever tried to reserve a really short N number when they come out occasionally at midnight knows that you will always be beaten out by someone out there in the U.S. who's using an automated computer script to grab those numbers before any human could possibly enter their name and address to reserve the number. And Congress is saying essentially that may not be fair to the general public, so let's look at ways to make this more fair so that everyone has an equal shot at reserving an N number. Section 805, Timely Resolution of Investigations. It requires the FAA to issue a final determination on any investigation into a person or entity left open for more than 2 years, unless the FAA determines after a review of the facts and status of the investigation that an extension is necessary. And it clarifies that the determination on whether to extend an investigation cannot be delegated to anyone other than persons in leadership positions in the FAA. So to me that says that an individual inspector can't decide to extend an investigation on their own. Someone in management has to do that. And Section 806 regarding all makes and models authorization. And I think an FAA all makes and models authorization for airmen typically refers to an authorization granted by the FAA to a certificated airman such as a mechanic or inspector, allowing them to work on a wide range of aircraft makes and models. And this section requires the FAA to reestablish that authorization for all makes and models for all types and makes of certain experimental single and multi-engine piston-powered aircraft. Section 807, Response to Letter of Investigation, that amends the Pilot's Bill of Rights to ensure that an individual has not less than 30 days to respond to a letter of investigation from the FAA after receipt of such letter. Section 808, and that's also related to Section 810. These both have to do with an ADS-B out equipage study. 808 says, 1, study, not later than 90 days after the date of an enactment of this act, the administrator shall initiate a study to determine A, the number of aircraft registered in the U.S. and any other aerial vehicles operating in the airspace of the U.S. that are not equipped with ADS-B, B, the requirements for and impact of expanding the dual-link architecture that is used below an altitude of flight level 180, C, the costs and benefits of equipage of ADS-B out. D, the cost and benefits of any accommodation made for aircraft with inoperable ADS-B out. E, reasons why aircraft owners choose not to equip or use an aircraft with ADS-B out. And F, ways to further incentivize aircraft owners to equip and use aircraft with ADS-B out. And skipping ahead to Section 810, which is development of low-cost voluntary ADS-B, that requires the FAA, working with representatives from industry, including pilots and aircraft owners, to develop a report regarding the development of a suitable position reporting system for voluntary use in certain airspace. And it says, A, in general, not later than 2 years after the date of enactment of this act, the administrator shall prepare a report on the development of a suitable position reporting system for voluntary use in covered airspace to facilitate traffic awareness. And it says covered airspace means airspace for which the use of ADS-B out equipment on an aircraft is not required. B, technical advice. In preparing the report under subsection A, the administrator shall solicit technical advice from representatives from 1, industry groups, including pilots, aircraft owners, avionics manufacturers, and 2, any others determined necessary by the administrator. Under C, requirements, it says, in preparing the report, the administrator shall 1, research and catalog domestic and international equipment, standards, and systems analogous to ADS-B, available as of the date of which the report is completed. 2, address strengths and weaknesses of such equipment, standards, and systems. 3, to enable the development and voluntary use of portable, installed, low-cost position reporting systems for use in covered airspace. And then A, provide recommendations on any regulatory and procedural changes to be taken by the administrator or other federal entities. And B, describe any equipment, standards, and systems that may be needed to be developed with respect to such reporting systems. And finally, B, they want to promote the benefits of the voluntary use in covered airspace of position reporting systems to enhance traffic awareness. Going back to Section 809, ensuring safe landings during an off-airport operation, this one's kind of interesting. The administrator shall not apply Section 9119, which I'll read you in a moment, in any manner that requires a pilot to continue a landing that is unsafe. Now, 9119 is the minimum safe altitudes rule. So, for example, if you're over any congested area of a city, town, or settlement, you have to be at an altitude of at least 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle within a horizontal radius of 2,000 feet of the aircraft, or if you're in other than congested areas, an altitude of 500 feet above the surface, and so on. So that's the minimum safe altitude rules. Section 809 is saying the FAA can't use these rules to require a pilot to continue a landing that is unsafe. Now, background on this, the purpose of this provision is to prevent future FAA enforcement actions, such as the case against Trent Palmer. It'll prohibit the FAA from applying a specific regulation in any manner that requires a pilot to continue a landing that is unsafe. Now, you may recall that Trent Palmer got a 120-day suspension of his pilot certificate after a flight that he made in November 2019 that included what he contends was a permissible low-altitude inspection pass over a neighborhood backyard where he considered landing but opted not to. Section 811, Airshow Safety Team. A, in general, not later than 180 days after the date of enactment of this act, the administrator may, as determined necessary by the administration, coordinate with the General Aviation Joint Safety Committee to establish an airshow safety team focused on airshow and aerial event safety. B, objective. The objective of the airshow safety team shall be 1, serve as a mechanism for federal government and industry cooperation, communication, and coordination on airshow and aerial event safety, and 2, reduce airshow and aerial event accidents and incidents through non-regulatory proactive safety strategies. C, activities. In carrying out the objectives pursuant to subsection B, the airshow safety team shall, at a minimum, 1, perform an analysis of airshow and aerial event accidents and incidents in conjunction with the safety analysis team. 2, publish and update every 2 years after initial publication an airshow safety plan that incorporates consensus-based and data-driven mitigation measures and non-regulatory safety strategies to improve and promote the safety of the public, performers, and airport personnel. And 3, engage the airshow and aerial event community to A, communicate non-regulatory proactive safety strategies identified by the airshow safety plan to mitigate incidents, and B, discuss best practices to uphold and maintain safety at events. Section 812, aircraft registration validity during the renewal process. It permits an aircraft to be operated on or after the expiration date found on your aircraft registration as if it were not expired, so long as you, the operator of such aircraft, have on board the aircraft A, documentation validating that 1. An aircraft registration renewal application form has been submitted to the administrator for such aircraft but not yet approved or denied, and 2. Such aircraft is compliant with maintenance, inspections, and any other requirements for the aircraft's airworthiness certificate, and B, the most recent aircraft registration. Section 813, an individual may obtain a temporary airman certificate from the FAA after requesting a permanent replacement airman certificate to replace a lost or stolen airman certificate. A temporary airman certificate shall be 1. Made available A, electronically to the individual immediately upon submitting an online application for a replacement certificate to the administrator, or B, physically to the individual at a Flight Standards District office. Section 814, a flight instructor, registered owner, lessor, or lessee of a covered aircraft shall not be required to obtain a letter of deviation authority from the FAA. So this expands the LOTA exclusion statute for experimental aircraft by covering limited and primary category aircraft to allow, conduct, or receive flight training, checking, and testing in such aircraft if the CFI is not providing both the training and the aircraft. 2, no person advertises or broadly offers the aircraft as available for flight training, checking, or testing. And 3, no person receives compensation for use of the aircraft for a specific flight during which flight training, checking, or testing was received, other than expenses for owning, operating, and maintaining the aircraft. Section 815, this is BasicMed for examiners who are administering test or proficiency checks. An examiner may administer a practical test like a check ride or proficiency check if such examiner meets the medical qualifications requirement under Part 68. The FAA has 3 years to implement this change. Section 816, the designee locator tool improvements. Not later than 3 years after the date of enactment of this act, the administrator shall ensure that the designee locator search function of the public website of the designee management system of the administration, and by the way, designees would include people like AMEs and DPEs, and it says the functionality has to 1, filter a search for an aviation medical examiner by sex if such information is available, 2, display credentials and aircraft qualifications of a DPE, and 3, display the scheduling availability of a DPE to administer a test or proficiency check to an airman. So hopefully that'll make it easier to find DPEs in aircraft that are somewhat rare. I know years ago I tried to find a DPE to give an instrument check ride in a Caravan, and we discovered that there was none in the U.S., but it took a lot of checking to figure that out. Ultimately, we got the FSDO to approve a DPE who had prior experience in the Caravan to give that check ride. Section 817, deadline to eliminate aircraft registration backlog. This section requires the FAA to take such actions as may be necessary to reduce and maintain the aircraft registration and recordation backlog at the Civil Aviation Registry so that on average, applications are processed no later than 10 business days after receipt, and they have to achieve this within 180 days. Section 818, this regards the Part 135 Air Carrier Certificate backlog. Now, this is going to be huge news for people who want to get into the Part 135 business. It says, 1, not later than 1 year after the date of enactment of this act, maintain an average application acceptance or rejection time of less than 60 days, and 2, not later than 2 years after the date of enactment of this act, maintain an average application acceptance or rejection time of less than 30 days. Now, I've talked with people in the past who have waited 18 months or longer for the FAA to respond to their application to get a Part 135 certificate. So this is going to be a huge change for that industry for people who are looking to get into that business. Section 819, enhancing processes for authorizing aircraft for service in commuter and on-demand operations. And this relates to aircraft conformity for Part 135 charter operations, and that involves ensuring that aircraft used in operations meet all applicable regulatory requirements, standards, and specifications. Now, that process is essential for verifying that the aircraft conforms to its type design and is a condition for safe operation. And that process is so time-consuming that I know of a Part 135 operator who, when they went to add a second aircraft, added the exact same make, model, and year of their first aircraft so that they could simplify the process of adding a second aircraft to their certificate. So hopefully this will make that a little bit more standardized and easier to do. Section 820, Flight Instructor Certificates. And what Section 819 does is establish a working group. And it says, one, that in general, not later than 180 days after the date of enactment of this act, the administrator shall establish a Part 135 aircraft conformity working group. And two, requirements, the working group shall study methods and make recommendations to clarify requirements and standardize the process for conducting and completing aircraft conformity processes in a timely manner for existing operators and air carriers operating aircraft under Part 135 and entering such aircraft into service. Section 820, this is kind of exciting for flight instructors. This is regarding flight instructor certificates. It's going to require the FAA to issue a final rule requiring the FAA to remove the expiration date on a CFI certificate. It says that not later than 18 months after the date of enactment of this act, the administrator shall issue a final rule for the rulemaking activity titled Removal of the Expiration Date on a Flight Instructor Certificate. And this relates to something published in the fall of 2022, which says, 1, remove the expiration date of a CFI certificate, and 2, replace the requirement that a flight instructor renews their flight instructor certificate with appropriate recent experience requirements for the holder of a flight instructor certificate to exercise the privileges of such certificate. Now, you may not know this, but the vast majority of CFI certificate holders, I believe, are airline pilots who renew their certificates every 2 years so that they can resume teaching if they happen to be furloughed by their airline and are out of a job. And if you as a CFI fail to renew your CFI every 2 years, you then need to take a check ride to reinstate it. And that's a significant burden. So CFIs work really hard to not let their certificate expire. And historically, for CFIs who aren't actively teaching, renewal meant spending 2 full days in a FERC, or Flight Instructor Renewal Clinic. Now, these days, FERCs are mostly online, but it's still a time-consuming process for a CFI to renew their certificate. And of course, what we don't know yet is what the FAA will decide is appropriate recent experience requirements. So hopefully experience requirements won't be too onerous, and CFIs will no longer be required to take another check ride if they haven't been active for a while. 821, consistency of policy application and flight standards and aircraft certification. Now, here's the problem this addresses. We sometimes joke in the industry that if you ask 10 different FSDOs for the answer to a question, you'll get 11 different answers. Now, this section looks like an attempt to address that issue. It reads, A, in general, the Inspector General of the DOT shall initiate audits as described in subsection D of the Flight Standards and Aircraft Certification Services of the FAA and the personnel of such offices on the consistency of 1, the interpretation of policies, orders, guidance, and regulations, and 2, the application of policies, orders, guidance, and regulations. B, components. In completing the audits required under this section, the Inspector General shall interview stakeholders, including at a minimum, individuals or entities that 1, hold a certificate or authorization related to the issue being audited, 2, are from different regions of the country with matters before different FSDOs or before different FAA Flight Standards Service and Aircraft Certification Service offices, 3, work with multiple FSDOs or aircraft certification offices of the administration, or 4, hold a single or multiple relevant certificates or authorization. Section 822, application of policies, orders, and guidance. And this looks like they've just made some word changes essentially to ensure consistency. 823, expansion of the Regulatory Consistency Communications Board. Again, some minor word changes. 824, modernization of special airworthiness certification rulemaking. That requires the FAA to issue a final rule for the rulemaking activity titled Modernization of Special Airworthiness Certification, or MOSAIC, within the next 24 months. Section 825, exclusion of gyroplanes from fuel system requirements. Essentially what they've done there is they've struck the word rotorcraft and inserted the word helicopter in each place so that gyroplanes will not have to follow the same fuel tank standard certification required for helicopters. Section 826, public aircraft flight time logging eligibility. That allows a pilot conducting certain public aircraft operations under the direct operational control of forestry and fire protection agencies to log flight time accrued in such aircraft. 827, the Eagle Initiative. It says, in general, the administrator shall continue to partner with industry and other federal government stakeholders in carrying out the Eliminate Aviation Gasoline Lead Emissions Initiative, referred to as the Eagle Initiative, including A, the safe elimination of the use of leaded aviation gasoline by piston-engine aircraft by the end of 2030, and the approval of the use of unleaded alternatives to leaded aviation gasoline for use in all piston-engine aircraft types and piston-engine models. Section 828, expansion of BasicMed. Now, this is a huge change for those of you who may be flying under BasicMed. It increases the maximum certification takeoff weight of an aircraft covered to 12,500 pounds, and that's up from 6,000 pounds. So now you can fly pretty big aircraft under BasicMed. It also increases the number of allowable passengers in a covered aircraft to 6, which is up from 5. And it also increases the allowable number of seats in a covered aircraft to 7, up from 6. These changes become applicable 180 days after the bill is signed into law. Section 829, this one's kind of interesting. Prohibition on using ADS-B out data to initiate an investigation. It prohibits the FAA from initiating an investigation, excluding a criminal investigation, of a person based exclusively on ADS-B out data. It does not preclude the FAA from using ADS-B data in civil investigations as long as the investigation was not originally initiated based on the sole review of such data. Section 830, charitable flight fuel reimbursement exemptions. It says, in general, 1, the validity of the exemption, except as otherwise provided in this subsection, an exemption from 61-113C that is granted by the administrator for the purpose of allowing a volunteer pilot to accept a reimbursement from a volunteer pilot organization for the fuel cost and airport fees attributed to a flight operation to provide charitable transportation pursuant to Section 821 of the FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012 shall be valid for 5 years. Failing to adhere, if the administration finds an exemption holder under paragraph 1 or a volunteer pilot fails to adhere to the conditions and limitations of the exemption described under such paragraph, the administrator may rescind or suspend the exemption. 3, no longer qualifying, if the administrator finds that such exemption holder no longer qualifies as a volunteer pilot organization, the administrator shall rescind such exemption. And there are a few other things as well. So if you are flying for charity and are getting a fuel exemption, you may want to read all the details of that section. Section 831, GAO report on charitable flights. This requires the GAO to initiate a review of charitable flights, including 1, a review of all applicable laws, regulations, policies, legal opinions, and guidance pertaining to charitable flights and the operation of such flights. 2, an assessment of petitions for exemption from the regulation that prohibits reimbursement for fuel costs for private pilots. And 3, such flights conducted without an exemption from the regulation that prohibits reimbursement for fuel costs for private pilots. Section 832, flight instructor or testing, says that an individual acting as an authorized additional pilot during Phase 1 flight testing of aircraft holding an experimental airworthiness certificate and meeting the requirements set forth in FAA regulations and policy in effect as of the date of enactment of this act shall not be deemed to be operating an aircraft carrying persons or property for compensation or hire. Section 833, the National Coordination Oversight of DPEs, or Designated Pilot Examiners. It's going to require the FAA to establish a national office to provide oversight and facilitate national coordination of DPEs. The section further requires the established office to consider whether to implement the final recommendations report issued by the DPE Reforms Working Group. And I think Jason Blair, who we've had on the show in the past, was part of that group, so we'll ask him to come on the show and talk about that sometime in the future. Section 834, this is Part 135, Pilot Supplemental Oxygen Requirements. It says, A, in general, not later than 1 year after the date of enactment of this act, the administrator shall issue a notice of proposed rulemaking considering whether to revise the requirements under Section 135.89b to apply only to aircraft operating at altitudes above flight level 410. In considerations, it says, in issuing the NPRM, the administrator shall consider applicable safety data and risks, including in relation to applicable incidents and accidents, as well as the investigations and recommendations of the NTSB. And now let's jump into some of the other sections outside of the GA section, and these come primarily from the AOPA's summary listing, and I'll include a link to that in our show notes. They've highlighted Section 770, which says that 100 low-lead availability requires airports that offered 100 low-lead aviation gasoline for sale in 2022 to continue offering such gasoline for sale until the earlier of 2030 or the date on which the FAA certifies an unleaded aviation gasoline alternative is available for purchase or use by GA aircraft operators. This provision does not cover airports in Santa Clara County, and they mention specifically Reed Hillview, but I'll mention that there are several other airports in the county, including Palo Alto, San Martin, and the San Jose International Airport. It says that in Alaska, the FAA may not restrict the use and availability of 100 low-lead avgas through December 31st, 2032, or 6 months after the FAA certifies a fuel is widely available throughout Alaska, whichever occurs first. Section 101, the Airport Improvement Program, or AIP/GA Airport Funding. It authorizes $4 billion a year for FAA's Airport Projects Program. This number represents an increase from the current $3.35 billion annual spending levels. Funding for GA airports will receive the lion's share of this increase, going from $670 million currently to $1 billion each year. Section 716, transient parking ramps. It creates a $34 million per year set-aside in the Small Airport Fund for construction of itinerant/transient GA parking. Section 703, airport revenue diversion penalty enhancements. It doubles the maximum penalty for an airport that illegally diverts airport revenue. Currently, the penalty is the amount equal to the illegal diversion in question plus interest. Section 749, airport diagram terminology. It requires the FAA to update certain policy and guidance to ensure the clear and consistent use of terms to delineate the types of airport parking available to GA pilots. Section 750, GAO study on FBO fee transparency. It directs a GAO study on the efforts of FBOs to meet their commitments to improve the online transparency of prices and fees for all aircraft and enhancing the customer experience for general and business aviation users. Section 710, Small Airport Letters of Intent. It requires the FAA to issue AIP letters of intent, or LOIs, to small airports. Under an LOI, the FAA agrees in advance to provide funding for an airport project, allowing an airport to plan large capital projects and receive financing for them. LOIs are currently restricted to capacity projects at large airports. Section 719, Protecting GA Airports from Closure. It ensures the FAA will only be able to permit grant-obligated airports, so those would be airports that have received money from the FAA in the last 20 years, to close if the closure will not significantly impair the aeronautical purpose of an airport, will not result in the permanent closure of an airport, or is necessary to protect the civil aviation interests of the U.S. Section 411, Aeromedical Innovation and Modernization Working Group. It establishes a working group of medical professionals and experts to review the FAA's medical processes, policies, and procedures, and to make recommendations to the administrator to ensure the timely and efficient certification of airmen. The working group would be required to assess the special issuance process and determine the appropriateness of the list of medical conditions under which an AME can issue a medical certificate. Section 413, Medical Portal Modernization Task Group. It requires an evaluation of the user interface and information sharing capabilities of an online medical portal administered by the FAA and provide recommendations to improve its functionality. This will help pilots, AMEs, and the FAA. Section 407, Airman's Medical Bill of Rights. It directs the FAA to develop an Airman's Medical Bill of Rights that details the rights of an individual before, during, and after a medical examination conducted by an AME. It also directs the FAA to develop a second document to explain the standard procedures performed during a medical examination conducted by an AME and to make these documents readily available. Section 418 provides veterans with pilot training. It requires DOT to establish a pilot program, no pun intended, to provide grants to eligible flight schools to provide flight training and educational activities to veterans who are not military aviators. The program is authorized at $5 million per year through 2028 to support veterans in their transition to become commercial pilots. Section 760, Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Area Special Flight Rules Area, or CFRA. It requires the FAA, in consultation with other federal departments, to conduct a study on the Washington, D.C. CFRA and Flight Restricted Zone, or FREEZE, to assess possible changes that decrease operational impacts and improve GA access to airports in the National Capital Region. Section 42, Alaska Aviation Safety Initiative. It sets a goal of reducing the rate of fatal aircraft accidents by 90% from 2019 to 2033. It directs the FAA to ensure installation and operation of automated weather reporting systems and the reliability and availability of information from those systems. The FAA will be directed to deploy visual weather observation systems and continue to assess the state of weather camera systems. And finally, Section 408, Improved Designee Misconduct Reporting Process. It directs the FAA to establish a streamlined process for individuals involved in incidents of alleged misconduct by an FAA designee, for example, an AME or pilot examiner, to report these incidents in a manner that protects the individual's privacy and confidentiality. Designees would also be required to report to the FAA any arrest, indictment, or conviction for violation of a local, state, or federal law. Now, if there are any major things in the Act that we haven't talked about that will affect you, please contact me and let me know so we can share that with everyone else. And of course, the best way to do that is to go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on the top of the page on either send a recording or contact to send an email. Now let's get to the good news. First, congratulations to mega supporter Jonathan Weisswasser. He says that he and Aviation News Talk listener Michael Rose went to Shelby, Alabama, and earned new ratings. Mike earned the airplane single-engine seaplane, and he says, I added airplane multi-engine seaplane. He says, we went to Water Wings Flight School and cannot say enough positive things about the quality of the aircraft or the instruction. Simply one of the very best flight schools around. Plus, flying seaplanes, as you know, is one of the most fun experiences a pilot can have. Yep, totally true. Congratulations to both Mike and Jonathan. And congratulations to listener Colby Keller. He writes, I passed my instrument check ride and wanted to thank you for the help to stay focused. I moved to Phoenix last year and got a job at Jackson Jet FBO to complete my goal of becoming a paid pilot. He says, one more step to go. So I'm guessing that's the commercial. So again, congratulations to you, Colby. And first, let me say I'm sorry I wasn't able to get a new episode out last week as I was on the road traveling for several days. And thanks to those of you who wrote and asked if I was okay. I was in the Northwest, which I absolutely love, and the weather was perfect. There was no rain, and it was in the low 70s, so just ideal weather. Now, one of the things I did was attend an all-day session with Cirrus for a meeting of West Coast-based Cirrus CSIP instructors. I've been teaching in these aircraft for about 19 years now, and I never miss an opportunity to attend these meetings as I get to see some of the other longtime CSIP instructors. And I got to sit next to my good friend John Fiskus, who runs the Flight Academy, which is a Cirrus-only flight school. John's generally acknowledged to be the highest-time CSIP instructor in the world, and he started teaching these aircraft from virtually the time they were introduced about 25 years ago. I also got to see his partner in the Flight Academy, Luke Lyson, who I last talked to several years ago over the radio when we were both flying Cirrus aircraft at the time, somewhere near Merced, California. And a good portion of the day-long meeting was about the new Cirrus G7, and I came away with pages of notes about these aircraft. So if you're thinking of buying a new SR-20 or SR-22 G7, please contact me before you place a purchase order, and I'll share some of these things with you. Also, while in the Northwest, I spent time in the Museum of Flight. Now, I don't visit a lot of aircraft museums, but like the Palm Springs Air Museum that I talked about late last year, this is a very impressive museum, and it's obvious that they are well funded as they have a very impressive facility and a collection of aircraft. Now, the Museum of Flight is located on Boeing Field, so it's easy to get to if you're flying in. It's about a 3 to 4 story building, and the main floor is open from the floor to the ceiling, and there are many aircraft that are hung in this area. One of the rare pieces I found interesting was a Lear Learfan 2100. Now, it looks very much like a business jet, but it had a pusher configuration in which 2 engines powered a single constant-speed 3 or 4-bladed prop at the rear of the aircraft. Now, only 3 of these aircraft were ever built, and they never entered production. And here's an interesting story about its first test flight. After the cancellation of a planned test flight on December 31st, 1980, due to technical issues, the first prototype went on to make its maiden flight a day later, on January 1st, 1981. But the date was officially recorded by sympathetic British government officials as December 32nd, 1980, in order to secure funding that expired at the end of 1980. Very clever. Development was abandoned in 1985. In addition to the structural problems that were discovered during pressurization of the all-composite fuselage, turns out the FAA refused to issue the prototype with an airworthiness certificate because of concerns that despite having 2 engines, that the combining gearbox that drove the single propeller was not adequately reliable. And the museum also had a rare Cessna that I'd never heard of, and that's the Cessna CG-2 primary glider from 1930. Now, the sign below the glider said that for $398, a CG-2 could be bought from a catalog, and the CG-2 could be pulled by automobile, towed aloft by an aircraft, or launched to flight speed by a slingshot-like shock cord from a hill or ridge. Cessna assigned construction numbers to at least 84 of these aircraft, though it's thought that up to 300 examples were built, but many were probably never officially licensed. And note that this was during the Great Depression, and Cessna was looking for ways to keep the company going, though ultimately that was not enough, and they shuttered the company for 3 years in the 1930s. Now, the museum was unique in a couple of ways. First, they had a large display that filled multiple rooms on the role of air traffic controllers, and they had interactive exhibits so that kids could play some role of an air traffic controller. But what I found unique was that their mock-up of the control tower cab actually protruded out of the side of the building, thus resembling a control tower when viewed from the outside. And the other unique thing was that the museum has an aircraft learning center for kids that's built around a 2003 Cirrus SR-20 that they use to teach kids about airplanes. There's a sign on the wall that says it's the Cirrus hangar. And here's what I said in a short video that I shot while walking around the Cirrus hangar and the airplane. Yeah, so they've got sectional charts. Here's the Cirrus aircraft, which was donated by Cirrus about 20 years ago. They've even got things for people to spot during the pre-flight. Notice the oil leak down there for people to spot. I understand there's a hydraulic leak as well. We've got a flat tire, and we can go in and check the oil. But of course, if you take a look at it, we've got vintage avionics. So 2003 was the first year Cirrus had the Aviation PFDs. Prior to that, it was round gauge instruments. Funny thing is, they said they have this airplane in here for something like 10 to 15 years with tens of thousands of kids going around it. And they said that the floor broke before the airplane broke. So anyway, check it out. Museum of Flight Aviation Learning Center in Seattle. And I counted 10 simulators that can be used to give some kind of flight experience to kids in the program. So overall, it seems like a very robust STEM program for exposing young people to aviation. So if you're looking to do that in your area, you may want to consider visiting the Museum of Flight to get more ideas for your local program. As you know, I do a lot of Vision Jet training, and there have been 2 minor incidents involving Vision Jets in the past week, which is pretty unusual. One was a taxiway excursion at KDWH, the Hooks Memorial Airport in Houston. The FAA's summary description said, aircraft brakes failed while taxiing for departure and rolled into the sea lane. Now, I've seen the video, and the aircraft is taxiing normally, though maybe just a little tiny bit fast. It then suddenly makes a left turn as if someone tried to apply both brakes to slow down, but the right brake failed. Now, unfortunately, that airport has a water runway 17W and 35W, that's adjacent to the taxiway. And as luck would have it, the Vision jet rolled right into the water. Now, the good news, of course, is that the aircraft's jet engine is mounted on top of the jet, so it likely wasn't damaged. But the bad news is that everything from the wing down was in the water, so there will probably been some water damage. Now, if it were a brake failure, it's just unfortunate that the left brake didn't fail instead, as the aircraft would have ended up in the grass instead of the water. The other incident occurred on Saturday at Wings Field in Bluebell, Pennsylvania, and this incident looks like many business jet accidents in that it was a runway overrun. The big difference being that there appears to have been relatively little damage to that Vision jet, whereas many business jet runway overruns total the aircraft and some are fatal. The runway at Wings Field is a relatively short 3,700 feet. Now, the shortest runway I've landed a Vision jet on is 3,500 feet at Santa Monica, and we had no difficulty doing that. But the big difference here is that the runway at Wings Field was wet. The weather at the time was winds calm and light rain was reported for several hours before the incident. The fact that the winds were calm was actually a disadvantage. Had there been a 10 or 20 knot headwind, that would have shortened the landing distance, and that might have been enough, as it appears the aircraft stopped within about 100 feet beyond the end of the runway, ending up with the right main landing gear in a ditch next to a road, with the right wingtip lying on the road. Now, the damage appears so minor that I think this will be classified as an incident rather than an accident, and the aircraft will likely only need minor repairs. But, I bet the owner wishes that runway had been 100 feet longer or that it hadn't been raining. And, of course, up until some point, a go-around probably could have been executed, though at some point, as you're running out of runway, going back to full power may just make things much worse if you won't be able to get off the ground again before the end of the runway. So go-arounds are a use-it-or-lose-it tool. They can help you if you execute them early enough, but they may make things worse if you don't get to rotation speed before you run out of runway, in which case you're better off just rolling off the runway at a slow speed, which this aircraft apparently did. Now, aviation is a small community, so see if you know any of these people who signed up to support the show in the past 2 weeks. First, we've got 2 new Omega supporters. These are the people who sign up via Patreon at the $50 a month level. In addition to getting access to my online courses, they get a free copy that I'll sign of one of my books and send to them after 2 months. So let's welcome Kenneth Solosky and Jarrett David, who headed his pledge up to $50 per month. We have several other new supporters on Patreon, including Eric Doberman, Alexander Lloyd, Bob, and Mike Marlowe. We also had some one-time donations via Venmo, thanks to Seawit Ewan, Larry Brown, and Brian Pullman, and also some one-time donations via Zelle, thanks to Colby Keller, Alexander Pitts, and Stephen Bell. And finally, we had some one-time donations via PayPal, thanks to Martin Brading, Andy Meeker, Robert Glasser, and Douglas McElveen. Thank you so much for everyone who supports the show. And if you've been listening for a while and get value from the show, I'd like to invite you to join the club and become part of the community that makes this all possible. And when you're thinking about how much to donate, well, you might think about what you pay to fly for an hour and make a one-time donation, or you might think of it as one of the many subscriptions that you already have, whether it's for Amazon Prime or Apple TV Plus or Netflix, and make a regular monthly donation, which you can set up to occur automatically via Patreon or PayPal. And all of this is just so easy to do. It'll take you just a couple minutes. Head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find 4 different ways to support the show. And if you choose to donate via Patreon, well, there's some goodies you get at the various contribution levels. And regardless of the paid level you choose, you'll get access to a different version of this show where you won't hear me asking you to support the show because, hey, you're already doing it. And of course, when you do support the show, no matter how you do it, I'll read your name on the show. Thanks so much for your help. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/support to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.